I don't think anything true can be a threat to anything good. So if your faith is shattered by the revelations of, say, cosmology, then you need to re-examine and come back to a fuller understanding of the world, because the architects of the scientific revolution, all of them to a man, said something like, God has invested me with understanding, so it would be an insult to him not to use it. He wouldn't just trick me by implanting this calculating machine in my brain and then expect me not to use it. What, so that I can prove my loyalty to him? Like, that's not how that works.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We got a special guest today, Spencer Klavan. You've been on the show before. I believe last time was to promote your book, How to Save the West. Still in progress on that whole plan, but you got a new book as well. How's it going?
I'm well, thanks. It's the long game on Western civilization, I regret to inform you. So
yeah,
in the meantime, we may as well amuse ourselves.
Sure, yeah. So I want to start with that just a little bit, because it is a long game. Give me a problem statement for what's wrong with the West.
Sure. Well, if I had to summarize it or define it, I'd say we've lost our purpose. Western civilization, as I understand it, when I use that word, I'm not just talking about a random group of countries or a particular place on the map. I'm talking about the cultural heritage of Athens and Jerusalem. So in Athens, you get sort of the birth of the great pagan philosophies of Greece and Rome, all that man can really know about his place in the universe using reason alone. And in Jerusalem, you get the revelation and the wisdom literature and the scriptures of the Jewish and Christian monotheists. And those two civilizations meet. They encounter one another, I think, really first, most explosively in Paul's sermon on the Areopagus, which we get in the book of Acts, where Paul basically converts a number of the Greek philosophers. But that little spark explodes out throughout the Roman Empire and creates what we now think of as the West, this incredible cultural heritage. And I would say that it's defined by an understanding of man's place at the center of the universe in the image of God, to understand and to go forth and subdue the world in the name of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And throughout all the many trials and tribulations, the kind of turmoil that we've faced throughout century upon century, that guiding mission has really defined the West. And I think we're in crisis over that mission. I think we sort of let ourselves be sold a bill of goods about what science says about the world, that science has somehow disproven God or rendered ancient wisdom irrelevant, when in fact, the more we learn about the natural world, the more we discover, the more challenges we're faced with, the more desperately we need our ancestral wisdom. So that's why I wrote that book, was just to remind people that we're not alone in history. We haven't kind of sprung magically out of our own niceness or virtue. We built this civilization generation after generation. And if we want to carry it forward, we're going to have to return to the roots of it, which ultimately for me are in God.
What do you think was or is rather the major leap between Greek, Roman paganism and then the Abrahamic religions that came later? Like what was, I mean, I try to think of it in terms of industrialization almost, you know what I mean? Like we've got these ideas, we know how to make tools and stuff like that, but now we know how to mass produce tools, right? It's a big difference. Is there I guess, a version of that happened between Greek pagan, because my understanding is pagan philosophy is essentially laying out philosophic ideas to explain both the natural world and the social order, right? Like, and that's been the reason I went to seminary. I'm not particularly religious myself, but I went to seminary because I was very curious about how human beings throughout history had come to terms with their own existence, right? And I agree with you. I think it ultimately came down to purpose. Right, we want to feel useful. We're biologically programmed to feel useful, right? To want to feel useful, rather. But what's the big leap that happened between, let's say, Seneca and Paul, for example?
Sure. I think I would picture it, I would visualize it in terms of a circle versus a line. So if you think of the pagan view of the world as a circle, the history repeats itself, these endless ongoing cycles in the universe, then the Jerusalem wisdom, the vision of the monotheists, kind of cuts through that with this linear vision of history that we're actually made for a purpose. We're going somewhere. We're destined to move forward toward God's kingdom. Now, there's a lot that you can understand within this cyclical vision of the universe. In fact, I would say everything that we can reason our way to on our own, you can get by just studying the natural world. And that's what the pagans were masterful at, especially guys like the Stoics, whom you reference with Seneca and, before them, Aristotle and the Peripatetics were basically inaugurating what we now think of as natural science. They were looking around and saying this stuff that we see all around us, the weather and the random mutations of chance, there's actually an underlying order to this. They called it the logos. And gradually they started to associate that with some kind of higher power, that maybe the mind of Zeus or the divine mind. But basically, this was all there is. What you see is what you get in the pagan universe. And once we go back to the dust, probably most pagans believe we are kind of re-assimilated into the grand cosmic all. If you think of the kind of pseudo-Buddhist ideas that we have now, that you just wash back into the ocean. And the revelation tradition, that is the scripture and the Bible, basically says, no, there's actually more to the story from outside. You can't just understand, you can't bootstrap your way up to total understanding from within the world. You actually need a picture of what's outside of the world and where the world came from. And to answer that question, you need an eternal destiny, that mankind's not just doesn't just happen to find himself here with this kind of temporary access to truth, but actually the fact that we're able to understand the universe hints at a destiny for us beyond the universe. And I think that kind of changed everything.
Yeah, there's a lot of commonality between the linear nature of Christianity, which is to say we're in a certain condition now, right? And our goal should be to reach salvation, and there's a prescription for that, obviously. And then the more general sense of linear history, where throughout history, a primary function of what we think of as a good man was to improve society on a generational basis for their family, right? And it correlates with a lot of evolutionary biologists have talked about this over the last 15 or so years, that our biological purpose isn't just to procreate, but to push our DNA as far into the future as possible, right? And with that comes essentials like social order, for example, right? There's a lot of commonality between these two things. And as you mentioned, our search for meaning, we've talked about this quite a bit as human beings over the years, but it leads us to many different things. People find themselves in many different places on this journey, but it should always lead to something other than ourselves, right? I think that's the critical point. It is a fact that every meaningful thing you do in life will be in the service of other people, starting probably with those closest around you, but then more broadly speaking, expands out to the rest of the world. And that is, to me, when I think of what the West needs to be saved from, it is a 20 or 2,000 or so year old story about a man named Narcissus who became so obsessed with himself that he looked in the mirror too long and turned into friggin' flowers. You know what I mean? It's like, that's where the word comes from. I don't know that most people know that that's what that is, because I hear people use the word narcissist a lot these days, and I'm not sure they are familiar with that, like the actual story, right? And I think, this is, everything you do is about someone other than yourself, right? I mean, that's we are biologically programmed to be communal like that, and that's why I don't know of any major religions, for example, or any major philosophies that prioritize the self over other people. That would be odd, frankly. It would be odd.
Yeah, in fact, there's this concept in Christianity, St. Augustine talks about this, of the curvatus in se. And that's his definition of sin. It means that which is curved inward toward itself.
Right. Which was kind of a novel idea at the time, because sin and death meant something like a rebuke, or sin would be a rebuke of God, death would be the absence of God, right? Because we were talking about spiritual death back then. The Hebrew word for death would have been like the absence of God. But Augustine, for the first time, was like kind of articulated what that really meant, I think.
Yeah, I think, this idea is compatible with all of those older ideas, which we get really from the Bible. But the notion that sin is what turns you inward toward yourself is kind of revolutionary because it does exactly what you say. It sort of proposes that the opposite of sin is life and love. That is the genuine recognition of something other than yourself as having purpose and meaning and significance in and of itself. When you think about what it really means to love another person, you think that you take that person's good as seriously as you take your own, and in some cases even more seriously if you're talking about sacrificial love. And so you compare that to the curvatus in se, which is the narcissus problem. It's basically doubling back on yourself, making everything about yourself. And the irony there is that not only do you destroy all the good stuff you can build otherwise, but you also end up destroying yourself, because we're not built, even as you say, biologically, we're not meant to thrive and flourish just by looking in the mirror all the time. I think this is why Jesus says he who would find his life must give it up. There's a core truth there, right? Even if you're not like familiar with the Gospels, or you prone to refer to them for your moral absolutes, there's just something deeply embedded there in what we are, that we're not designed this way. And I would add, I think, since we're talking about differences between pagans and Christians, or the Judeo-Christian tradition, that if you're looking outside of yourself and you're trying to better the world outside of you, the next question becomes like, better in what direction and in what way?
Yeah.
And you look at the Romans, for instance, obviously hugely triumphant people in a lot of ways, accomplished enormous things that remain with us today. But they have this idea of the mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors, which almost boils down to, you're never going to be as good as your father. In fact, your whole purpose in life is just to minimize the disappointment. Try to fall as little short as possible from the great old days before you. And interestingly, Christianity has a slightly different, and I would say more forward-looking way of approaching this, that it has to do with the possibility of actually building. That, people had talked in the ancient world, just to give one example of, it might be nice to abolish slavery. I mean, the Stoics were very anti-slavery. They thought it was an affront to our natural equality. But it was the Christians who, over centuries, eventually discredited slavery in the developed world and abolished it in the major modern countries, because they had this idea that they were playing the long game, that they were striding toward a future, even in a broken world, even in this desperate kind of morass of sin that we all find ourselves in. There's somewhere we're going, and there's an idea of the good in front of us.
Yeah.
And that's almost synonymous with purpose.
Yeah, I think, and if you're looking for, it can be difficult to tell what's meaningful now, and then what's a true first principle that would be meaningful in any time, right? And that this idea of rejecting incurvatus and say, and then embracing the communal nature of human beings is something that has persisted throughout all religion, all philosophy. I mean, Gandhi 2,000 years later, you mentioned the Stoics. Gandhi 2,000 years later uttered the phrase, if you want to truly find yourself, lose yourself in the service of others. You know what I mean? It's like this isn't unique to any particular brand of thought. It is something that is, I think, obvious to human beings when you are able to look beyond yourself. And it seems like a lot of this. It seems like a lot of this selfishness is kind of wrapped up in this scarcity versus abundance mindset stuff. I guess that's the modern way of articulating that problem statement, is scarcity versus abundance. In some ways, I'm not sure it fully captures the Abrahamic version of it, but in my mind, that's a big thing. It's like when I happen upon a resource, whatever it happens to be, whether it's my own time even, or food or shelter, things that we all need, or sometimes a little more ephemeral, like like upward mobility as a concept, things like that. We tend to, in times of panic, I would say the majority of people tend to hoard more, right? But our instinct should be to give more, right? Because, and it's the really interesting part about this to me is how it is applying these philosophical ideas to economics, right? So if you think about recession, depression, the best way to handle this stuff is to start putting more money into the hands of more people, right? Like this as a mathematical concept that works. You know what I mean?
Right.
One of my favorite things as a student of history is when there's overlap between like mathematics and philosophy, right? I don't know if there's a word for that, but it just it speaks to the truth of the universe. You know what I mean? Whether you believe that's God or whether you believe it's just a bunch of math problems and floating around in the sky or whatever you believe in, right? I think it's really interesting when that happens. And to me, when I see alignment on those two things, I know that's the truth.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that actually some of these things, which seem so obvious once you see them, aren't instinctive to us.
Sure,
So,
yeah.
like you said, right, you feel instantly you're threatened, and what you instantly do, you recoil back into yourself, and you want to hoard what you have. But as you indicate, there's actually sort of a counterintuitive to us principle that indicates we should do the opposite. And I think this reminds me of something I have to grapple with a lot in the founding documents of the country, and the idea that, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that famous Declaration of Independence claim. And you look at what they go on to say: we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You think, are those truths self-evident? I mean, it seems like it took people a long time to figure this out. And you start to realize that what they're talking about when they use that term, self-evident, is not that everybody everywhere will just naturally intuit them or figure them out instinctively, but that once we work our way to them through reasoning and, as you say, comparing different kinds of reasoning to one another, then once you see them, you kind of can't unsee them. That is, they justify themselves, or they become clear in every possible domain. So there's something precious about this too, I would say. There's something that we can't just luck upon it or rely on people to kind of know this stuff. You actually have to work your way to it, grind it out over centuries, and then carry it through. You know, that is I think one reason why we find ourselves in this predicament. It's like we got so convinced of our self-evident truths that we just thought anybody could figure them out, because we're so nice and we're so virtuous that surely we will know that everybody has a right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. But in fact, it's like that stuff goes away over a very few generations if you don't tend to it.
Yeah, and then it's another like interesting parallel to me is the I guess you could call it the philosophical evolution versus the political evolution. And maybe these two things are always intrinsically tied together, but it took a very long time. Yeah, you're right, for us to realize this stuff. I mean, you see hints of it through history. One guy writing a little like, hey, you know, maybe people should have autonomy over their own lives, for example, right? And we're talking about like fairness as a concept that's evolved over time from, you know, the Magna Carta, for the first time, a king limiting their own, I guess, authority over their people to some degree, right? I guess John didn't really believe any of that stuff. He was just trying to get himself out of a mess, but it did get on paper. But then, to a larger degree, I would say the early 16th century with the peasant revolt, right? That was a big deal.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. The idea that my time and my property are my own. Maybe for the first time in a major kingdom like that, people started to believe that stuff because, you know, we're talking about a time. King John, for example, this idea of the king's deer was very prevalent then. And then, you know, we go through Reformation, Renaissance, blah, 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 to where we are today. It is interesting. What are your thoughts on that? Why did these ideas have to evolve over time? Like, is that part of, if you look at human history, should we look at that the same way we look at the individual human life, where you learn and get better as time goes on? And then what goal should we be setting for the future, right? Because we tend to, when things get calm and safe, do a lot of
Yeah.
stupid shit. Like we get dumber, like the less
Right.
pressure is on us.
Yeah. Well, that part was well known to the pagans. I mean, this is their famous idea of the cycle of regimes. The modern version of this is, hard times make strong men make good times make weak men make hard times. And that is, I think, sort of baked in. And it's one reason why the pagan world looked cyclical. It looked like we're just trapped in this hamster wheel, basically. And so my answer to your question would probably be that there are some things that we can get from just our natural instincts that are just kind of built in, baked into our biology. But that if you stop there, you actually find out that the system's a little broken. Like there's a glitch where our survival instinct or our natural animal impulses aren't enough to lead us to virtue. And you look at there's sort of the evolutionary landscape, and you think there's lots of things that might evolve to lead us to survival. Very few of those things look like anything like what we long for as human beings. We have this like extra longing on top of that for the good, the true, and the beautiful. And we talk about things like love and self-sacrifice, and yeah, they have utility up to a point, but they also have their own intrinsic value. And to get there, you kind of need a light that breaks in from the outside, that interrupts the automatic grinding, churning processes of nature and says, you sometimes have to act against your instincts. Your instincts are not the highest thing in the world. There's something higher than nature and mere biology. So, where do we aim? I would say it's at that which we're capable of seeing that no other animal is capable of seeing. The pigs don't sit around and debate the trolley problem. And the reason for that is they can't see what we can see. We're actually tapped into something. And again, you don't have to clothe it in traditional religious language, but you do, I think, have to grasp the nettle that what we can see is something more than just matter in motion. And the ancients would have defined it according to the seven virtues: courage, prudence, faith, hope. These things, Paul says, endure. That is, they are eternal over and above our biology. So I think that's kind of what we've lost sight of, and what we should be aiming at is like what, especially with AI, right, and all these machines that are so much better than us at a lot of just material tasks. We're up against this question. Well, what are we good for? And I think the answer is the stuff that you can't calculate, the stuff that actually transcends the material world.
Doesn't it kind of feel like the same parallel between talent and skill, where you could be born with a great body for sports, for example, or a great mind for thinking a certain way? Maybe it's linear thinking, maybe it's abstract thinking. But if you don't work hard and develop those skills, you'll never be as good as you really could be, right? So we're given this gift of human nature, I guess gift and curse, right, of human nature to some degree. And then it is upon us to chisel away the parts that shouldn't be there, or add to, or whatever the case is, and turn that into a finished product, for lack of a better phrase.
I think that's a great analogy. Yeah, like I am never gonna dunk a basketball on LeBron James, right? That's just not baked in. But I would happily challenge LeBron James to a debate on tax policy, right? Like we do come into the world with certain obvious attributes, and just as a species more generally, we've got these gifts, and I would describe it as like creation is good, and we're a great part of creation, maybe even the best part of creation. But as you say, even raw talent, even good stuff, requires cultivation and direction. And if you think about that for a second, the fact that we can cultivate our talents and choose which way to direct them and decide whether we're going to put in the effort or not kind of liberates us in this amazing way from the determinism of biology, from just the logic of cause and effect. And this is a very mysterious thing. There's something scientists even still don't quite understand how it is that we're self-conscious, self-aware, able to direct our own course of action. But I think it's the key to everything. I think it's why, as never mind Westerners, just human beings, we're on this earth.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting one to me. To your point, overall, will is the ultimate liberator in a lot of ways. Like most things that
Yes,
exist
yeah,
don't have it. Actually, everything except for us, at least
yeah,
don't have a developed sense of the will. And I think having will, and forget about the term free will, just will, having will in general, correlates with knowing what the self is, whatever your concept of your personal identity is, right? Because that's the foundation through which we process all this information and decide things, whatever you want to call it. And one of the most interesting things to me is somebody who's a big fan of science, for example, is who is Spencer Klavan exactly? You're not your body,
yeah.
right? Like we know. Here's how we know that. By the way, for a generally active person who eats a lot of protein, has a good diet, generally speaking, somewhere between 2 and 3 years, every 2 or 3 years, every cell in your body, literally every cell, is different than the ones that are there right now, right? So 2.5 years from now, not one cell, not your brain, your teeth, your eyes, none of that shit will be the same. So you're not just the sum of your physical parts. It can't be that, right? So then what is it? You know what I mean? That's a big problem for, I guess you could call them atheists or whomever it is, right? And I think it's a problem that we stop. Like, and I'm going to segue into your next book because I think it's really interesting. I think it's a big problem for people because I don't know what exists beyond myself. Frankly, I have no I have ideas about stuff, inklings, maybe theories, concepts, but I don't really know what's going on out there. But what I do know is that me, Dan Holloway, I'm not this. Like it's something else,
Right.
and I have no idea
Right.
what the hell it is. But it is interesting, right? And you can't really, with absolute certainty, nail it down. I think some of this observation happens even in the negative space. Like, for example, the way I'm defining self right now is mostly what I'm not. Like, I know I'm not this, right? So it must be something else. Now, your new book is Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith.
Right.
Tell me about the concepts in this book.
Sure. Well, I think we've really been talking about a lot of this. It grew out of my first book, How to Save the West. And in that book, I really came down to the problem of materialism. I was sort of laid out a bunch of crises in the first book that the West is facing. And the one that just kept coming back to me was this loss of purpose and this idea that we are really just a heap of atoms in a sea of atoms. And like you're saying, whatever it is that we are, it can't be that. And if you think that that's what you are, a chemistry set in a meat sack, a bunch of electrochemical impulses, whatever, you're going to end up in despair because all the most important parts of your life are going to be meaningless or illusory. They're going to seem like just random brain farts, basically. And so, Light of the Mind, Light of the World is an argument from the perspective of science and from the history of science that science itself doesn't actually teach us that. Like, there's more to science than just the picture of us as this very complicated machine, highly advanced wetware. And that actually, even when we do science, when we measure things, when we talk about the objective, quote unquote, world, we're applying concepts that exist nowhere that we know of except in human consciousness. So even things like position in space and duration over time. I mean, you want to get really trippy about it. Like, just think about the sound waves that we're hearing right now that are enabling us to have this conversation, right? A sound wave is a vibration, which means that if you take a snapshot of us and the position of every molecule and atom and even down to the like quark and boson in our bodies at any instant in this conversation, the sound wave is nowhere to be found. The mere voice that you are hearing right now is nowhere to be found in the raw matter of us. What happens is that an infinite number of those tiny snapshot moments get added together in something called the mind, so that over time this pattern establishes, and that pattern translates into the qualitative experience of listening to each other talk, and that enables us to connect. And so the book is aimed basically, I would say, guys just like you who are open to this stuff, but feel like the language of faith, the Bible, and all the trappings that typically come with church, feel like that might be some kind of obstacle to understanding the world in its most granular, physical, hard-nosed way that science teaches us. And the book just says, no, that's actually kind of outdated. Like, in order even to understand science, you have to have a bigger picture of the world than just matter in motion. Sure. And I make that argument by telling the story of how science emerged out of the quest to understand God's creation, and then how I think in the modern day it's actually kind of pointing us back to some of these ancient ideas, like the soul, which is really what we mean when we say consciousness, and that we actually kind of can't get away from.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way, if you are someone who's paid attention to the development of string theory, for example, over the last 50 or so years, we are like the physical matter that we are, and not just us, but the desk, the planet itself, the sun, the way, like, physical matter is affecting some other unknown substance. We call it space-time. We don't know what the hell that means, right? Like the idea, like the reason the sun or the Earth rotates around the sun is because the sun is making a giant, I mean, think of it as a blanket with a ball sitting on top of it, and it's creating a divot, and then the concave that creates, the Earth just kind of circles around it like circling a drain. We're not directly affecting other matter. We're affecting these ephemeral properties that we can't see. Like, we have theories for them. Some of the math works out, but it doesn't really make sense, to be honest, to the average person. Right. And maybe we're just stupid, right? Who knows? But I hate the idea that on both, and I've found myself caught in this same trap over the years as well. I hate the idea of people of faith just accepting things, and I hate the idea of people who are against faith rejecting things because of X, Y, or Z without going further, or the assumption that the faith, as it were, demands that you just believe it without proof. Because one of Paul's most poignant and famous quotes is, "Study all things and hold fast to what's true." Right? Like, there was never like the architect of the New Testament didn't ask anybody to just believe shit. It's like, study things and figure it out and make sure you know what's going on there. That was the call to action. It wasn't just like, hey, we demand blind faith, which is interesting because the church did kind of go away from Paul for quite a few years. But it's interesting. We're kind of just vibrating the world around us to some degree. You know what I mean? It's very bizarre to me. But the idea that even when we do discover things and have a better definition of what's happening in the natural world, and that should be some reason to eliminate faith altogether, the smartest people in the history of the world did not believe that. Spinoza did not believe that. Einstein did not believe that, right? Like, their concept of God may have been different than yours, but there was a concept there.
Totally. And the book kind of opens with this two-front approach that says, yeah, I'm talking here to people that are totally uninterested in faith because they think it's going to shut down their rational mind. But I'm also talking to religious people who think that science is somehow a threat to their belief. I don't think anything true can be a threat to anything good. Mm-hmm. So if your faith is shattered by the revelations of, say, cosmology, then you need to re-examine and come back to a fuller understanding of the world. Because the architects of the scientific revolution, all of them, to a man, said something like, God has invested me with understanding, so it would be an insult to him not to use it. He wouldn't just trick me by implanting this calculating machine in my brain and then expect me not to use it what, so that I can prove my loyalty to him? Like, that's not how that works. And that impulse gave rise to science, and it's actually still the only reason we have any way of expecting that the current problems we face, like for instance in string theory, as you indicate, or some of the problems with quantum gravity, right? These are paradoxes of a kind that we've faced before in history. And in the past, whenever we faced them, we said, no, the human mind is actually designed to figure this out. And that's why we were confident. We had no other reason to think that, ape brains could unpack this stuff. It's only because there was this conviction that no, the mind is actually more than just an accident. It's a key. It's a key to the universe. And so, yeah, I would sort of argue, I think, that when we limit ourselves to this kind of purely material view of the universe, we actually shut ourselves off not just to faith, but to science. I mean, that thing about curvature of space-time that you're talking about, right? This is Einstein's magisterial discovery, and he's coming at the opening of the 20th century, and he's looking at the history of science up to that point, which has really taken off with Newton. And in Newton, you picture the world as this big empty box called absolute space, in which objects move around, like apples that fall from trees and planets that soar across the stratosphere and all that stuff. And that's a very convenient and useful way of figuring some things out. But Einstein's whole thing is, no, actually, that's not the full picture. And we know this because light doesn't move in the way that that picture would suggest. It has all these weird properties. And it's from that he starts to think, actually, matter itself emerges out of something much more mysterious, of a field, from the sort of interaction of field forces. And once you're in that territory, I don't think even Einstein really fully reckoned with the box he was opening, because how could he have?
Yeah.
But like, once you're in that territory, you're not talking about just a machine anymore. You're talking about something much more mysterious, having to do with the interaction between mind and matter. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah. So we're in an interesting period now.
Right.
I agree. I think it's very myopic to dismiss religion. For example, one of the and at the time Darwin took a lot of heat for it. Darwin, who was not an atheist, took a lot of heat for this. Like, oh, you're trying to replace blah blah blah. It's like, okay, cool. Everything we know about life is cyclical to some degree, right? Like, trees don't just exist; they are seeds and become trees, and then create new ones, and so on and so forth. That's always been a problem for me. The idea that the fact that things evolve over time is somehow either a threat to religion, or that it's proof that it's not real. You know what I mean? Or that it's not useful, rather, or faith, not religion, faith. It's like, even with we just talked about this a moment ago, but even with the general concepts that are first principles to human life have evolved over time, and our understanding of them has improved over time. And then also, I think, if you want to talk about natural forces, gravity, the relationship between nuclear fusion and gravity, for example, right, which is a symbiotic relationship. The reason that we have stars and planets, or the reason we have stars, is simply because there is a relationship between those two things, where matter compresses, fuses together, explodes, but then the force of gravity holds it together. That's why stars exist. That's why all of everything exists, right, in our universe. And then I think about this in more practical terms. Maybe, religion is a natural way of managing our spiritual lives, in the same way that politics is a way of managing our social lives. You know what I mean? Like, maybe that's the science. Maybe religion is the science to managing our spiritual lives, and science becomes corrupted, as we know, right, over time.
Sure.
So don't just dismiss this as a concept because, the church is fucked up or this or that, right? Like, that's not how that works. A scientist being wrong doesn't mean that science as a concept doesn't exist.
That's beautifully put. Yeah, you want to know about the stars, you use a telescope, right? You want to know about microbiomes, you use a microscope. You want to know about your soul, you refer to faith. You refer to the wisdom tradition. This is a technology for knowing stuff like any other. And we haven't moved away from the things that faith teaches about. In fact, we're still puzzling over consciousness, self-awareness, all the stuff that we've been talking about now. And it's there that the language of the Bible, even if it's been, as you say, corrupted or misused, actually teaches us the most that we can know. I would pick up on something that you said about this idea that like evolution should shatter faith or something, because it's a really important point. A lot of times you'll get religious people who will rush to say, no, evolution doesn't disprove science because let me show you how the world really was made in 7 24-hour days. And I understand that impulse, but I think it's a confusion in terms. And I actually think that somebody like Augustine wouldn't have felt the need to make that argument because before science started looking into these things, ancient Christians were quite comfortable saying things like, well, before the sun and the moon were created, surely the term day means something different. Surely we're talking here in human terms about a reality and a process that occurred outside of the scope of human understanding. It was before we were around. So it would be crazy kind of to expect it to look and sound exactly like the kind of thing that we now record with science. And the days of Genesis may well not be 7 days of creation in the 24-hour sense. They might be 7 periods. They might be 7 modes of creation. All of this stuff is in the church fathers. And the church was much more open to this until you got this idea that, well, science has now found that it's 13 billion years or whatever. And so that disproves, quote unquote, disproves the Bible. And Christians made a mistake when they got defensive and said, no, like we can show you that we have exactly the right measurement of time. That was accepting the premise that the only kind of truth there is, the only way of describing the world is in these bare material quantifiable ways, when in fact the Bible's speaking about something much more profound that you need in order to fully understand your life, but that doesn't extend into the same domain that science does of the measurable and the observable and all the stuff that we study when we use microscopes and telescopes.
Yeah, I mean, so this was a big part, I think, to your point of, as a matter of fact, this is my favorite part of the Reformation because the doctrinal stuff doesn't really appeal to me that much. It does insofar as it's interesting to see how it developed over time and the infighting and then just the politics of it and all that stuff. But
Yeah.
the best part for me of the Reformation was people like people like Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, people like this who started to look at all these church doctrines and be like, well, this isn't in the Bible. Where did this come from? Right? The idea of papal infallibility, that's not found anywhere in the Bible. You guys just made that shit up. You know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
if we're going to appeal to authority, let's appeal to the one authority that we all agree on, which is the Bible, right? That was my favorite part of it. And then, on the other side of that, from the anti-science wing of religion, people like Ken Ham have done so much damage. Right, they've created this argument that need not exist, in my opinion. That has given deeply religious people an excuse to not explore the truth. Right, which is a horrifying thing because some of the greatest scientists in the history of the world were deeply religious, like Newton, for example, and found meaning. Religious, like spiritual meaning in the natural world, like and now you've taken that gift away from people, and then he also drives away logical people from religion, which you could say is far more damaging if you do indeed believe that soteriology, like the path to salvation, is the purpose of humanity. Right, you're driving people away from that to make some point that doesn't matter. It's like it doesn't matter. There's nowhere in the Bible that says if you believe in evolution, you can't go to heaven, right? So why the fuck are you talking about that? If you really believe this stuff, if you truly believe it, how dare you drive people away from this idea?
I mean, totally agree. I think there's probably blame to go around on both sides, right?
Sure,
There was
yeah.
a lot of like, oh, science, the war between science and
Mm.
religion. This stuff really got going in the 19th century, actually, right around when Darwin was publishing and all that. But then there was also, as you say, this reaction that Jesus actually talks about this in the Gospels of like adding burdens on that aren't part
Well,
of
yeah,
the way
Revelation talks
that
about that
like you
too. Anybody that adds to or takes from this, that's a big no-no,
yeah,
right? We'll never see
it's
the
not a
kingdom of
good
heaven.
thing.
Yeah.
Right. And this pattern that you're describing, or this process that you're describing in the Reformation, is directly tied to the scientific revolution. And I
Mm.
would say that we think of both of those as these very confident movements, like, oh, we've really discovered the truth about the Bible, or we've really discovered the truth about the material world. And there was a lot of that, but I would describe them both at base as a crisis of what we would call epistemology.
Mm.
That is, people really trying to figure out like how can we know the truth and what's the right way to know the various kinds of truth that we're able to know. And in the wake of all the church crisis, all the problems over the authority of the Catholic Church and the Pope and so forth, you have these guys like Descartes, for example, grabbing onto the things that can be most securely known and trying to find a foothold there. And then Bacon, right? This idea that like what we can observe is true, right?
Mm.
And I think that a lot of the problems that came after that, a lot of the materialism were just based on people clinging to like, well, we can if we can measure it, then it's true. And everything else is just sort of subjective
Right.
argumentation and interpretation. But these hard material facts of the world, like that's what really exists. But I don't think that, you know, either science or religion is really served by that. I think both disciplines require a bigger vision. And you need, again, to come back to Augustine, he talks about the book of nature and the book of scripture, right? These two different but agreeing truths that are being taught to us all the time. And if one contradicts the other, you have to kind of go back to each and try to understand where you've gone wrong. So yeah, I think this problem that we're facing, which again is coming to a head now as we our technology gets so excellent and we start to like really advance, we're going to have to really decide like are we just in the business of rearranging atoms around? Because if that's all we're about, then like ChatGPT is going to do that better than us in like
Sure.
20 years or something.
And
right?
also, Dr.
So
Manhattan is right that there's no difference between living and deceased atoms. So what's the
yes,
point, right?
yes, exactly. What is the point? And I think in order to answer that question, you can't just measure things. You have to actually have a vision of the world, like we were talking about at the beginning. You have to have an idea of the good. And I am arguing in this book that that idea is expressed in the Bible, hasn't been undone by science, and is actually kind of necessary to survive in the technological age.
Yeah. I mean, if only the material world that can be measured in a physical sense is important or actually exists, or however you want to say that, then what? Again, I'll bring it back to this: who are you exactly, right?
Yes.
You're not. We can establish, we can demonstrably establish that you're not just an amalgamation of cells, right? Whatever consciousness or soul, whatever it is, and then I think to me, the best part about this is that someone who doesn't believe in or even care necessarily about the concept of God, and then somebody who's deeply religious, can come to quite a few agreements, if not a totality of agreement at the highest level, about how we should all live our lives in a broad sense, right? And the early, to some degree, the early Muslims even agreed on this, because they agreed with they saw Jesus probably the way that a lot of deists saw Jesus, is like that's an example of how a man should live their life, right? Whether you believe in the deity of Jesus or not, right? Which was in question until sometime later in the church after its founding. But whether you believe in that or not, or any of the specific doctrinal tenets, right? The minutia to some degree, like some of this stuff is very important to religious people. I don't mean to marginalize that. I'm saying that there is a lot of intersection. If you think about it in this way, there's a lot of intersection on this stuff. Like we all know that there are observable things in sociology that map onto the things that religious people have said over the years, right? Like observations that have been made. Like if you think about, you know, just if you think about historical writers, whether they're pagans or religious, or part of the Abrahamic faith, who have you know, kind of done thought experiments about this stuff over the years, and then you see that they're saying a lot of the same stuff. That should be smoke for you. Like you should see smoke and be like, okay, there's something deeper going on here. So why are we arguing about what name we're calling what instead of observing what the hell's actually going on around us? You know what I mean? It seems like the same kind of distraction as, well, everybody wants low taxes, cheap energy, and housing, right? But you're Republican, so fuck you. You know what I mean? Like that's it almost seems like a manufactured controversy to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite thinkers just of all time. He talks about this thing that he calls the Tao. It's a Chinese word, like the Tao Te Ching, it's just the way. And it's basically what you're saying. He says you could call it something else, you could call it the Logos, you could call it whatever, but he called it the Tao just to emphasize that even if you go like all the way to China, you'll still find some of these basic principles, such as, for example, piety towards your elders, I think is one of the examples he gives, but he gives a bunch of them. And he just says, like, that is either an extremely interesting but ultimately meaningless coincidence, or it's evidence of a faculty that we have, like like the same way we have sight, right? The same way our eyes can see. Human beings seem to also have a sense of the moral universe as something real. And just like people everywhere have like a word for tree, except in places where there are no trees, like if people everywhere have a word for justice or a word for piety, it would be very, very odd if they were just responding to nothing. And it doesn't make sense to say they're just responding to evolutionary impulses, because some of this stuff cuts against the grain of evolution. Some of this makes you actually less capable of surviving and propagating, like self-sacrifice, you know? So yeah, I think like even if you are totally allergic to church talk, which I, by the way, totally get and relate very much to being turned off by some of the happy clappy stuff. Like, even if that's true, you got to be at least a little curious about what it is we're talking about when all of human history all over the world is keyed into this moral reality.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, frankly, I don't know what it is. I mean, part of my brain thinks that the soul or whatever the fuck it is like some kind of physical object in a fourth spatial dimension or something like that. You know what I mean? Who knows? Really? Who knows? I don't. But then, does that object also have a soul in the fifth? I mean, what the fuck? You know, some of this stuff is mind bending to some degree, but it does seem like all of these people throughout history, and then, you know, people more broadly. I mean, I'm talking about specific folks. They're drawing from the same well. Let's call it our epistemology, right? We don't know that, like, epistemology is a collective set of facts that we all agree upon for the most part, but we're using different words for stuff and saying the same thing quite a bit. Now, there are some leaps taken by both sides of this, if you want to call it an argument. For me, it's not an argument, really. It's more of like a conversation. But on both sides of this conversation, then, there are people saying the same thing and using different words, like talking about there have been some decent books on this too. I think that before he went absolutely crazy, the Moral Landscape by Sam, whatever the fuck, was a really good. Sam Harris, yeah, was a really good. He's just like completely deranged by Trump now, but the Moral Landscape is a very interesting idea that there's some kind of physical science property to how we come about our morality and how we exercise our morality. I think that's really interesting. And if you read his book, and then you read like some kind of if you read how I guess deists would have come upon their morality, right? through an examination of both, which is something they were particularly good at, an examination of both the physical world and the spiritual world. You're going to see a lot of overlap there. And again, it's like once you see smoke like that, once you see commonality like that, you have to immediately recognize that there's a deeper principle at work. Maybe one you see, maybe one you can't see, right? And the problem that folks seem to have is like, well, should I care? Should it matter to me that there's the deeper principle? Like for me, it's okay that there is a deeper principle and that I can see it and I'm going to live my life that way, because that to me is meaning. You know what I mean? It's like, I know that this is the right thing to do based on my observation. I know it's right to be kind to other people. I know it's right to, think of other people before myself. I know it's right to protect people, right? That's something that we are, as men, especially biologically programmed to do. I don't need that. I don't need that extra step for it to be religious. You know what I mean? But I think the religion part, what it does add is the sense of community, which we desperately want, right? So for me, I have the good benefit of having this job, right? To be able to have these conversations all the time. And then just in my personal life, have conversations like this because I'm surrounded by it all the time. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate your time. Appreciate the explanation and the conversation, all that stuff. Everybody go check out the book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith, by Spencer Klavan. Thank you again. Thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.